They rolled their eyes before they even touched the wrapping paper. My grandkids, so sure they knew what kind of gift a grandmother gives. Something outdated, something forgettable. But what they didn't know was that buried under the wrinkled paper and lumpy tape was a piece of our family's history. One I'd carried quietly for decades. When they finally opened it, the room went still. Their laughter faded. Their hands stopped moving, because the gift wasn't just for them. It was about who we were, what we lost, and what still mattered. And in that moment, they finally saw me not as an old woman, but as the keeper of something they never knew they needed. It was still early when she stepped out of the car, the winter cold biting through the sleeves of her worn wool coat. Her breath hung in the air like soft clouds, and the driveway was slick with a thin layer of frost that hadn't quite melted under the weak morning sun. She moved slowly, carefully, the way people do when they've learned the ground can't always be trusted. In her arms were 3 packages, none of them square, none of them neat. They looked like they'd been wrapped by someone in a hurry, or someone who no longer cared for the polished rituals of tape and ribbon. The largest gift was misshapen and lumpy, its paper crinkled around the corners with too much Scotch tape holding it together. Another one bulged oddly from one side, as if whatever was inside had resisted confinement. The third looked like it had been wrapped in newspaper, not even the Sunday kind, just a faded sheet from the classified section. Tucked into the folds of each was a small handwritten tag with the grandchildren's names written in her familiar, slightly slanted script. Inside the house, the tree was already lit. Her daughter-in-law had done it up in gold and white this year, tasteful and minimalist. Not a single ornament out of place. The grandkids, Owen and Lily, were sprawled across the couch with their phones. One eye on the screen, the other on the stack of gifts gathering under the tree. The television was playing some holiday movie in the background, one of those forgettable ones with too much snow and not enough soul. When she walked in with the packages, there was a polite pause. Her son rose to help her set the gifts down, but Owen beat him to it, reaching out with a teenager's clumsy helpfulness and an eye roll half disguised by his shaggy hair. "What is this? Duct tape?" Owen asked, half laughing as he inspected. "The gift with his name on it. Looks like it survived a tornado." Lily stifled a giggle, though she tried to make it seem like she wasn't being unkind. "It's kind of vintage," she said, tilting her head and smiling in that rehearsed way teenagers do when they're not sure whether to mock or pity. Their grandmother didn't say anything. She just smiled softly and took off her coat, draping it over the back of the dining chair like she'd done every Christmas morning for as long as they could remember. She didn't bristle or defend the way she'd wrapped the gifts. She didn't explain that her hands, once steady enough to thread the tiniest of needles, now trembled just enough to make the task frustrating. Or that she'd run out of wrapping, papered 2 gifts in, and had found the newspaper under a stack of coupons near the bread box. She simply sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and watched. The gifts didn't match the others under the tree. Those were bright, uniform, and symmetrical tied, with metallic bows and crisp edges like something out of a catalog. Hers looked like they'd come from a different era entirely. Maybe they had. Later, when it came time to open presents, her gifts were pushed to the side at first. Not maliciously, just absent-mindedly, like the way you might set aside a fruitcake or a handmade scarf. The kids went through the big boxes first. Electronics, clothes, gift cards tucked into festive envelopes. There were polite thank yous, quick photos snapped for Instagram, and distracted nods before they reached for the oddly wrapped parcels with their names on them. "I think this one's vibrating," Owen said with mock concern, shaking the package lightly. "Should I be worried?" Lily giggled again, and even their father chuckled. "Just open it, buddy," he said, so Owen did. Carefully at first, then faster, the paper tearing away like bark from a tree. Inside wasn't something that made noise or lit up. No batteries, no cords. Just a small wooden box, the kind with a simple latch and worn edges. He lifted the lid and stared, not quite understanding what he was looking at. There was no gadget, no game, nothing familiar. Just a handful of old envelopes, each one marked with his name and something else dates, phrases. One said, "For when you feel lost." Another, "Open this when you think you've failed." Laughter stopped. Lily leaned closer, her own gift now in her lap, still unopened. The room shifted, just slightly. The kind of shift you don't notice right away. It's only when you realize the air's gone still and no one's speaking. Their grandmother didn't say anything. She didn't explain. Just sat quietly, hands folded again, watching them the way someone might watch a sunrise they've seen many times before knowing exactly what's coming, and choosing to let others discover it in their own time. Lily didn't open hers right away. She held it in her hands like something fragile, though it clearly wasn't. The wrapping paper crinkled beneath her fingers, a faded snowman print from at least 10 years ago. The edges slightly torn, corners reinforced with yellowing tape. She wasn't sure why she hadn't torn into it the moment it was handed to her. Maybe it was Owen's reaction that had unsettled her. Or maybe it was the look on Grandma's face, soft, quiet, expectant, but not in the way most people look. When they give a gift, there's no pressure, no waiting for praise, just stillness. She looked across the room at Owen, who was still holding the box he'd unwrapped. He hadn't pulled anything else out yet. Just the envelopes sat there, resting on his lap like unopened mail from another world. "Are you gonna read one?" she asked. Owen shrugged. "I don't know. It's kind of weird, right?" But he didn't sound annoyed anymore. Just confused. Their father cleared his throat and smiled politely, the way adults do when they're trying not to make something a big deal. "Why don't you see what's in yours, Lily?" So she did. She slipped her thumb under the brittle tape and pulled the paper away slowly, trying not to rip it. The box inside was similar to Owen's, but smaller. The bit of dust in the corners and a tiny brass latch that clicked when she opened it. Inside were more envelopes, each one addressed to her in Grandma's handwriting. Her name looked different on them than it did in texts or on school rosters. More careful, like it had been written with someone thinking about her the whole time. The first envelope read, "To Lily. When you feel ordinary." She stared at the words, not sure what to make of them. She hadn't told anyone she'd been feeling like that lately. Not exactly. But maybe it had shown in the way she'd stopped raising her hand in class. The way she avoided posting her artwork online, convinced it wasn't good enough. She'd never said it out loud, not even to her best friend. And yet here it was. Written years ago, sealed in an envelope, waiting. Grandma didn't say anything. She just reached for her mug of coffee and took a slow sip, her gaze drifting toward the window where the gray light of morning had finally begun to brighten. Lily didn't open the envelope. Not yet. She just held it, her fingers tracing the edges, wondering how long it had been sitting in that box. How long her grandmother had been planning this. She remembered birthdays from when she was little, crayons, cudgels, a quilt stitched by hand that she hadn't appreciated at the time. She remembered being 5 years old and unwrapping a dollhouse made entirely of shoeboxes, with hand-drawn wallpaper and furniture made from thread spools and cardboard scraps. At the time, she'd cried because it didn't look like the one in the catalog. She didn't remember saying thank you. But she remembered the look on Grandma's face, that quiet smile that never quite reached her eyes. Now, sitting here in a room full of expensive gifts and blinking electronics, Lily realized this wasn't the first time they dismissed something their grandmother had given them. It had happened in small ways, shrugged off stories. Jokes about her old stuff, glazed eyes during long tales at the dinner table. No one meant harm, but harm had still been done. Her grandmother had always given in the same way, without explanation, without fanfare. And each time her gifts had gone underappreciated, forgotten. This moment felt like all of that arriving at once. The culmination of years of not paying enough attention. Across from her, Owen was holding one of his envelopes now. He hadn't opened it, but he looked different. It's like something had softened behind his usual smirk. "Do you think she's been writing these for a long time?" he asked quietly. I think she's been waiting a long time for us to notice." Lily replied no one said anything after that. The room, once filled with the rustling of wrapping paper and fake laughter, had settled into something heavier. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. A kind of reverence that didn't belong to new gadgets or shiny things. A silence that asked for listening. Their mother came in with a tray of cinnamon rolls. But she paused when she saw the three of them, her kids, holding boxes of envelopes. Her mother sitting quietly. Eyes closed now, as if resting in the moment. She didn't ask questions. Just set the tray down and stepped back out. Lily looked at her grandmother again. "Did you make one of these for everyone?" she asked. Her grandmother's eyes opened slowly. "Not everyone," she said, "just the ones who needed them." Lily felt her throat tighten. She looked down, at the envelope again. "What made you think I'd need this one?" Grandma didn't answer right away. Then she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "'Cause I did once." The words sat there, quiet and solid. Lily nodded slowly, and this time, when she opened the envelope, she wasn't laughing. Neither was Owen, and no one rolled. Their eyes, the living room, looked the same as it always did on Christmas morning, scattered ribbons. Empty mugs on coasters, and the scent of cinnamon still clinging to the air. But something about it had changed. Not in the furniture or the lighting, but in the way everyone moved, slower, more careful, as if no one wanted to break whatever fragile thread had been spun between them all in the last hour. Their grandmother sat quietly in the corner armchair, her feet tucked under her like she had when she was younger, and could still sit that way without paying for it the next day. Her cardigan was buttoned all the way up, mismatched earrings dangling under soft silver hair. She looked peaceful, but not relaxed. There was a kind of still tension in her posture, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only now just set it down. Lily was rereading the letter she'd opened. She didn't say anything, but her fingers lingered on the words like they were trying to learn them by touch. Owen had unsealed the second envelope, but hadn't. Read it yet? He just held it, his expression unreadable for once. No one asked where the idea for the boxes came from. No one asked why now, because somewhere deep down, they already understood this wasn't about Christmas at all. It wasn't even about them, not entirely. It was about her, about the years she'd spent thinking about the people they were becoming. And the people they might be someday when no one else was there to remind them of where they came from. The boxes weren't the gift. They were the delivery system. She had started writing the letters after her husband died. Not all at once, and not with any grand plan. The first one came on a day when the house was too quiet and the grief too loud. She'd taken out a sheet of paper reel stationery, not the printer paper her son brought her once a year, and started writing. To no one in particular. And yet, somehow it ended up addressed to Owen. He'd only been 8 at the time, just learning how to ride his bike. But that letter had been for an older Owen, one she imagined would need to hear something when the world had made him doubt himself. She never expected to keep writing. But the next week, there was another letter, then another. Eventually, she had dozens each, sealed, labeled, and dated. She tucked them away in old recipe boxes, photo albums, and shoe boxes with missing lids. Every few months, she added a new one, not always after something dramatic. Sometimes just after a memory bubbled up, something her husband had said, or something she wished someone had said to her when she was young and uncertain and full of questions no one had time to answer. There was no audience for these letters. Not then. Just the faint hope that someday someone would want to know what she thought. Not what she bought or baked or passed down through family traditions, but what she really knew. It's the kind of knowing that only comes from decades of living and losing, and learning to start over. When her arthritis got worse, she almost stopped. The tremble in her hands made it hard to hold a pen. The words came slower, but she found that typing them didn't feel the same. So she kept going, writing with her whole body, shoulders hunched, wrist braced, glasses sliding down her nose. Every letter was effort. Every envelope sealed with care, even when she wasn't sure they'd ever be opened. The idea to give them as gifts hadn't come until that fall. When she watched her grandchildren leave after a rushed birthday lunch, distracted by deadlines and dates and 100 other things they couldn't quite name, they hugged her in that way people do when they're already moving toward the door. And in that moment, she'd known time was short. And if she waited for the perfect opportunity to hand over these pieces of her heart she might never get, the chance she spent the next few weeks going through the letters, sorting them, adding a few more where she thought they were needed. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. Not her son, not her daughter-in-law, not her friends at church who would have asked too many questions. She just wrapped each box with what she had: scraps of paper, leftover twine, a spool of curling ribbon from some forgotten drawer. Labeled them one by one on Christmas morning. When she walked in carrying those odd-looking gifts, she hadn't expected much. She knew how the kids would react. She'd seen it before. It's a polite smile, the careful setting aside, the dismissive glance. She had steeled herself for it, but she had given the gifts anyway, because the giving had never been about their reaction. It had been about the act, self. About taking something invisible and putting it into form, about recording all the things she might not be able to say out loud when the moment came, about making sure that long after her voice was gone from this world, it would still echo in theirs. She didn't need them to thank her. She didn't even need them to understand right away. She just needed them to know someday that she had tried, that she had seen them even when they didn't see her, that she had believed in them enough to leave something behind. She looked at Owen and Lily now, watching them not as children, but as people growing into themselves. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a forgotten figure at the edge of their story. She felt present, necessary. Heard Dot, and she smiled quietly because she had finally given them something they couldn't roll their eyes at, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. She hadn't gone into the secondhand store with any real plan. It had just been one of those cold Thursdays in early October, the kind where the sun barely broke through the clouds and the wind bit at her wrists no matter how tightly she wrapped her scarf. The kind of day where the house felt too quiet and the memories too loud. She didn't need anything, not really. But she parked outside the thrift shop anyway, its faded green awning flapping a little in the wind, and made her way in past the tinkling bell on the door. The smell hit her first. A mixture of old paper, mothballs, and something vaguely citrus from a candle someone had once left burning too long. It wasn't pleasant exactly, but it was familiar. The kind of scent that settled deep in your memory whether you wanted it to or not. She made her way slowly past the shelves of chipped glassware, the racks of forgotten holiday sweaters, and the overflowing bins of children's books with cracked spines. Her fingers brushed across the backs of old photo frames, her eyes catching glimpses of stranger smiles behind glass. People long gone. Families that once sat 4 posed portraits in stiff clothes and now rested in a bin marked 50% off. And then she saw a shoebox, plain and unassuming, nestled between 2 old dictionaries on the back shelf that had no lid, and its corners were soft with age. Inside were scraps of paper, a few yellowed postcards, and one single, unopened envelope with no name on it. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The paper was brittle, but the ink still dark enough to make out a date. June 14th, 1963. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. It wasn't the words inside that drew her. It was the idea that someone, decades ago, had taken the time to write something they thought might matter. Something meant for someone, maybe never delivered, or maybe just forgotten. She bought the box for $2. Back home, she set it on the kitchen table next to the old tea tin where she kept stamps and safety pins and coupons she never used. She left it there for a while, unopened, unsure of what she was supposed to do with it. She had dozens of boxes already tucked in closets, under beds, behind the coats in the hallway. But this one felt different. This one had reminded her of something. When she finally opened the envelope inside, it wasn't profound. Just a short letter from a man to his sister about a birthday party he couldn't attend. But it was the handwriting that stopped her. Loopy, careful, deliberate, full of pauses and commas and second thoughts. She held it up to the window, letting the afternoon light spill across the words, and for a moment she imagined the man who wrote it, his hand holding the pen, his breath steadying as he wrote the word sorry and tried to make it sound softer than it felt. That night she pulled out her own letters. It's the ones she'd written over the past few years, tucked into different corners of the house. Some were unfinished, some were written in haste, some were more journal entries than messages. But they were hers, and they mattered. She began organizing them, not by date, but by feeling. It's one box for moments of fear, one for love, one for loneliness, another for pride. She found old envelopes in a drawer, some yellowed, some crisp, and began labeling them, carefully, deliberately. Not with generic tags like to Owen or to Lily, but with thoughts, invitations, warnings, reminders. For when you feel invisible, when the world feels too loud, when you're about to give up, each one meant to be found at the right moment when the person reading it might finally be ready to hear her voice again. When she needed more space. She went back to that same second-hand store. The clerk, a young woman with a ring in her nose and chipped nail polish, smiled faintly as she brought another handful of old boxes to the counter. "You collect paper?" the girl asked, scanning the items. "I suppose I collect what people leave behind," the grandmother said. The girl nodded slowly. "That's kind of beautiful." She didn't say it aloud, but she thought so too. Back home, she found an old recipe box that had once belonged to her mother. The faded label still read holiday baking in red marker. She cleaned it gently, wiped the dust from the corners, and lined it with blue gingham fabric from an old apron. Into it went the most personal letters, the ones that held pieces of her soul, the ones she'd never meant to share until now. She knew the grandkids wouldn't understand at first. She'd already pictured the look on Owen's face when he saw the box. The way Lily might smirk at the crooked tape. But she also knew that once they opened the envelopes once, they really read what was inside, something might shift. Maybe not right away. Maybe not this Christmas. But someday. Because the letters weren't meant to be impressive. They weren't meant to dazzle. They were meant to last, to linger. To meet the reader in a quiet moment years down the line and say, "I knew you before. You even knew yourself. And I loved you then, too." The shoebox from the thrift store still sat on the table. Empty now, but not forgotten. She placed one of her own letters inside it, a spare one, labeled simply, "For anyone who needs it." Then she sealed the box, wrote "free" in bold marker across the top, and placed it on her front porch beside the other things she was donating. She never found out who took it, but that didn't matter. Sometimes the gift isn't the box. It's the hands that passed it along. There was something quiet about the way the envelopes rustled. Not the sharp, crisp sound of new paper, but a softer murmur like old leaves in a breeze or pages in a long-forgotten book. Owen noticed it first. The texture of the envelope in his hand. Kate felt different. Not smooth like the ones they used for school permission slips or holiday cards, but fibrous and just slightly rough, like it had been held and reheld, written and rewritten. There was weight in that paper. Not physical weight, but something else. Something that made his chest feel just a little heavier the longer he stared at it. Across the room, Lily was flipping through her box slowly now. She wasn't reading anything, yet just looking at the fronts. Some envelopes were faded, the ink lighter on the corners where her grandmother's thumb must have held it steady. Others had smudges, tiny fingerprints, or tea stains. Maybe, and nearly all of them were dated. Sometimes the dates were from years ago. Other times, they were recent. One was marked only with a season, summer, when everything felt too fast. Another read, January, on a day when you feel hollow. Lily paused at one that was labeled with a name and then a line underneath. To Lily, when you think you don't matter. She held that one a little longer before setting it aside. Her fingers lingered on the corner, like she was trying to decide whether or not she was ready to open it. There was no order to them, no numbering system. It wasn't a set of instructions or a timeline. It was more like a conversation paused in dozens of places. A voice that had left breadcrumbs, hoping someone would pick them up one at a time whenever they needed them most. There. Grandmother didn't say anything. She hadn't said much since the boxes were opened. She sat with her hands in her lap, her cup of tea cooling beside her. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed the faintest twitch in her fingers, like a pianist waiting for the next note, unsure if the music was still hers to play. Owen opened one dot. It was dated 4 years ago. The ink was darker, the handwriting steadier. To Owen, on a day you fail, he hesitated, then slid his thumb under the flap. The letter inside was only a few lines long. You will fail. Everyone does. But that doesn't make you less. It makes you human. Don't let it harden you. Don't let it make you cruel to yourself. Mistakes are just proof you're still trying. I will always be proud of you for trying. He read it twice, then folded it and placed it back inside. His face didn't change much, but something in his posture did. He wasn't slouching anymore. He sat a little straighter, like the words had propped him up from the inside. Lily opened one too. To Lily, when your heart gets broken. She frowned. That hasn't happened, she said quietly. Not yet. Her grandmother replied softly, without looking up. The letter inside wasn't dramatic. It didn't offer solutions. It didn't rant about the person who might cause the pain. It simply described the way a person's chest can ache without bruising, how grief can make everything else feel far away, and how despite it all the ache does lessen. How one morning you'll wake up and realize you didn't think about them first, that you laughed fully for the first time in weeks. That life, unfair as it is, still finds a way forward. Lily folded it slowly. She didn't say anything. The stack of envelopes wasn't just a gift. It was a map. A kind of emotional compass drawn from years of watching them grow and change and struggle, sometimes silently. Their grandmother hadn't asked for permission to write these things. She hadn't waited for the right time to share her thoughts. She had simply decided that silence wasn't the legacy she wanted to leave. Each envelope was a place where she had met her own past and tried to reach forward into their future. They were less about solving problems and more about giving company to those problems. Offering a kind of presence years after she might no longer be able to sit beside them in person. Owen picked up another. This one's got my name on it, and says, when you lose someone. Lily looked up. Is it about Grandpa? He nodded. Maybe, or maybe someone else someday. Lily looked back into her own box. She wrote a lot of these. She must have been working on them for years, Owen said. Their grandmother finally looked at them, her gaze steady and soft. I started after he died, she said. At first I just wrote to him, then to you. And then I just kept writing. Owen asked, did you ever think you wouldn't give them to us? She paused. I wasn't sure if you'd ever be ready to want them. The room fell quiet again, not awkward, just full. The kind of silence that comes after something important has been said, the kind of silence that knows it doesn't need to be filled right away. The envelopes sat in their laps, unopened but not ignored. Each one waited. Patient, quiet, a voice across time. Ready when they were. It was Owen who finally reached for the letter that had first caught his eye. The one that had been sitting right on top of the stack from the beginning. Its envelope was a little thicker than the others. Not newer, if anything. More worn around the edge, but heavier somehow. Like it carried something more than just paper. It read, to Owen, when you feel like you don't belong. He didn't know why the words stuck with him. Maybe because they felt too close to something he didn't like admitting. He wasn't used to saying things like that out loud. He was the sarcastic one, the easy laugh. It's the joke before the silence. But lately, especially this past year, he'd been feeling exactly that. Like no matter where he was always a half step out of sync. Like the world had quietly voted him out of the group and just hadn't bothered to tell him. He hadn't planned to open another letter right away. But this one felt different. Like maybe it was already open in some way. He broke the seal gently, careful not to tear the paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakable, his grandmother's, but smaller this time, more deliberate. There was a shakiness in the loops, like she'd taken her time with every word. He cleared his throat quietly and began to read. Owen, there are going to be days, maybe more than days, when you walk into a room and feel like no one sees you. Not really. When it seems like everyone else has been handed a script and you're stuck improvising your way through a part you never auditioned for. I know that feeling. I've lived it more than you might imagine. And I want you to know something important. Right now, while you're still figuring out where your place is in this wide, strange world, you do belong. You belong in every room where kindness is needed. You belong in every conversation where someone's telling the truth. You belong in moments of laughter in spaces that feel too quiet, in the arms of people who recognize the parts of you that you keep hidden. There is nothing wrong with being the one who notices too much, who speaks less but feels more. The world doesn't always reward that. But don't let it convince you that your softness is a flaw. It's your compass. There were years years when I felt like the extra person in the room. Like the chair pulled in from the hallway when there weren't enough places at the table. I know how that wears on you. I know how lonely it can feel to keep showing up anyway. But you have something that can't be taught, Owen. You listen. You see, you care deeply, even when you pretend not to. That's rare. That's valuable. I may not be around when you find the people who will see you clearly. But I believe you will. And when you do, you'll understand something that took me far too long to learn, that not fitting in isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's the beginning of finding where you were meant to be all along. The room was quiet by the time Owen finished. He hadn't realized he was reading out loud until he looked up and saw Lily watching him, eyes glassy. Their dad had gone quiet in the kitchen, leaning against the doorway, holding his coffee mug with both hands and not sipping. Owen folded the letter slowly, then pressed it back into the envelope. He didn't speak for a moment. Not because he didn't want to, but because there didn't seem to be any words that could follow that. He looked at his grandmother. She wasn't smiling, not exactly. But there was a kind of peace in her face, a softness in the corners of her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. She knew he'd understood. I didn't think you noticed, he said finally. I always noticed, she replied. You just weren't ready to believe it. He looked down at the letter again. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope slowly, as if memorizing its shape. I've been having a hard time at school, he said, quieter now. Like ... with people. I thought I was doing something wrong. You weren't, she said. Sometimes people just don't know how to make room for someone honest. Lily reached over and touched his arm. Not dramatically. Just a small gesture. But it was the first time in a while she'd touched him without teasing or telling him to move. And he didn't pull away. It occurred to Owen in that quiet moment that maybe the letters weren't just about what had been written in them. Maybe they were about what they unlocked between people, what they allowed to be said or seen or felt. He had never cried in front of his grandmother before. But now, sitting in that room with the lights dimmed and the wrapping paper long forgotten, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not sadness, not exactly, just release. And something very close to relief, because someone had seen him. Not just now, but years ago, before he even knew how much he needed to be seen, and someone had written it down, folded it carefully, labeled it, saved it for him. Lily hadn't touched her envelope in almost 20 minutes. It sat beside her on the coffee table, right where she'd placed it after reading the words on the front to Lily. When you feel ordinary. She had read those words again and again, almost expecting them to change, but they never did. That was the thing about her grandmother, she didn't exaggerate. She said things simply, and once she said them, she meant them. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again, soft, slow flakes drifting past the glass like a memory playing on loop. Inside the living room, the tree lights blinked rhythmically, casting faint gold onto the walls. The hum of the furnace filled the silence. Along with the distant clink of dishes being washed in the kitchen, no one pressed her to open it. Not Owen, not her father, and certainly not her grandmother. They just let her sit with it. Lily had never described herself as ordinary, not out loud. She wore bright colors when others wore neutrals. She filled sketchbooks with portraits and forests and invented cities. She had always been the creative one. But somewhere between the start of high school and now, something had shifted. Her art wasn't getting likes anymore. Her drawings felt dull next to others online. She'd begun to feel smaller at the very thing she once believed made her different. And she didn't talk about it. Not even to her best friend. Definitely not to her family. But somehow this envelope knew. She picked it up slowly, her fingers running across the handwritten label one more time. The flap was sealed tight, but not cruelly. Like it was waiting patiently. She opened it. The paper inside was soft from age, slightly crinkled at the edges. Her grandmother's handwriting flowed across the page in long, curving strokes still. Beautiful, even with the tremble that had started to creep in over the years. Lily, the world will try to tell you who you are. It will offer labels, compare you to others, and measure you in numbers, likes, grades, test scores, job titles. It will do this so loudly that you might forget to listen for your own voice. And sometimes, when all that noise gets inside you, you'll begin to wonder if you're anything special at all. You'll sit at your desk and look at someone else's drawing and think yours looks like a copy. You'll hear a song and feel like every word you could have written has already been sung better by someone else. You'll scroll through perfect photos and edited lives and start to believe you've missed something. But hear me now. Lily, you are not ordinary. You never were. Ordinary is a trick of comparison. It's what we feel when we forget that our way of seeing the world is entirely our own. And your way of seeing through color, shape, shadow, expression is something I have watched in quiet awe since the day you first drew a sun with a blue crayon instead of yellow. You never asked permission to create, and you never needed to. You don't need applause to be extraordinary. You don't need to be famous or flawless or fast. You just need to keep choosing your voice over silence, your brush over the blank page. Keep making things, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. The most beautiful things I've ever seen from you came when you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just trying to feel your way forward. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be known to be meaningful. And you don't have to be perfect to be loved. You already are. By the time Lily finished reading, she couldn't quite speak. Her eyes remained on the letter, scanning it again, even though the words were already memorized. Her throat was tight and her cheeks were warm, though she didn't feel embarrassed. Just still. Owen looked over at her, then leaned forward slightly. Like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just waited. Lily finally looked up, blinking fast. She wrote this. Years ago. Their grandmother gave the faintest nod. I wasn't sure when you'd need it, she said, but I knew you would. Lily looked down at her hands. Didn't even realize I felt this way. That's the hardest part, her grandmother replied. Sneaks up on you. Makes you believe that doubt is just your new shape. Lily folded the letter gently, carefully aligning the edges before slipping it back into the envelope. Held it for a moment, then placed it in her lap and looked at her grandmother. Did you ever feel ordinary? She asked. Her grandmother smiled. Not the kind of smile people give when they're being polite. A real one, sad at the edges. More times than I can count, she said. But every time I felt that way, something reminded me. A letter. Note, a child's drawing on my fridge. A little girl who painted a dragon with feathers instead of scales. Lily exhaled, the smallest laugh escaping. I remember that one. Everyone thought it was a turkey. But you knew what it was? Her grandmother said. That's what matters. Lily nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She just sat with her letter, her thoughts, and the quiet sense that maybe, just maybe, she had been seen. Not for the things she showed the world, but for the things she thought no one else could see at all. And it felt like opening a window she didn't know had been shut. The photograph had always been there. On the mantel, slightly off-center, inside a modest wooden frame. It showed a young man in uniform, his arm slung casually around a fellow soldier, both of them squinting into the sun, half smiles on their faces. It was the kind of picture people pass 100 times and never really stop to see. Owen and Lily knew it was their grandfather. Of course, they'd heard the stories in bits and pieces, always shared in that nostalgic, abbreviated way adults use when they aren't sure kids are really listening. But the letters changed that. Until now, he had been more of an idea than a person, a myth threaded through holidays and family photos. A name spoken gently, always in past tense. He had died before either of them was born. And in their minds, he had always been slightly blurred, like a memory inherited instead of lived. But in the envelopes he had written, he became something else entirely. Real, present, messy, kind, and fully human. Lily found the first letter from him tucked deep in her box. One labeled simply, "To my granddaughter, who I will never meet." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The paper inside was yellower than the others. Its handwriting, bold slanted, was different from her grandmother's, but unmistakably his. Dear Lily, if you're reading this, it means time. Did what time always does, moved forward without me. I wish I could be there to know you, to see your face, to hear what you sound like when you laugh. But even if I can't be part of your life in the usual way, I hope I can leave you a little peace of mind. The letter wasn't long, but it read like a conversation. He wrote about the kinds of things no one else had ever told her. How he met her grandmother, how scared he'd been to propose, how he'd cried when their father was born, though no one else ever knew that. He described her father's first steps, the way he once tried to name the family dog Fork, and the exact moment he knew he wasn't just a soldier or a husband, but a father. By the end of the letter, Lily had tears on her cheeks, even though she wasn't sure exactly why. It wasn't a sad letter, but it made her feel something that was hard to name. Something like being held by someone she had missed her whole life without realizing it. Owen's letter came next. It was buried under a stack of notes and marked with a date from over 20 years ago. It was addressed to my grandson if I'm not there. Hey kid, this is strange. Writing to someone I haven't met, but I wanted to talk to you anyway. I don't know what you're like. Maybe you like math, maybe you hate it. Maybe you love music, or skateboards, or books, or making things with your hands. I don't know. But I know this. Whoever you are, you're already enough. It wasn't a lecture, it wasn't advice. It was just a voice, reaching through years, offering something gentle and unshakable. A sense of pride that didn't have to be earned. A kind of love that didn't wait for proof. Owen didn't say anything for a while after he read it. He just sat there, letter in hand, staring at the photo above the fireplace. The man in the frame looked younger than Owen had realized. And braver somehow, not because of the uniform, but because of what he'd chosen to do with his life, when no one was watching. Why didn't anyone ever say he wrote letters like these? Owen finally asked. Their grandmother was quiet for a moment. Because they weren't for us, she said. They were for you. He knew he wouldn't be around. Lily asked softly. He always hoped he would, she said. But after the first scare, he started writing. He didn't want to leave empty spaces behind. There had been a scare, Then, that was new. They had never heard that part. He had a heart attack when your father was in high school, she continued. He recovered, but it changed how he saw time. He started writing things down. Not for me, not even for your dad, for the people who hadn't arrived yet. She looked at them both now, Lily, with a letter in her lap, Owen still gripping his in both hands. He said once that it didn't matter if you got to meet someone in life. What mattered was whether you left something behind that told them who you really were. And now they were holding that in their hands. Letters filled with jokes, memories, and pieces of advice that weren't clitched or preachy, but personal and small. One talked about the day he learned to drive and scraped his father's truck against the mailbox. Another described how he learned to bake bread from a war buddy during downtime between deployments. Each letter was less about achievement and more about being alive. Lily reached for another one addressed from him. The envelope was nearly blank. Just a single word written across the front. Someday. I think this one's meant for later. She said to her grandmother, nodded. There are a few like that. He didn't believe everything needed to be opened at once. Kara carefully placed his letter back in the box, laying it flat as if placing something sacred. He looked up at the photo again, this time with a new kind of respect. He was really thoughtful, he said. He was, their grandmother agreed, and quiet. The kind of man who didn't talk much but remembered everything. They didn't open any more letters that day, not because they didn't want to, but because they'd found something rare, something people their age didn't always get, a glimpse into a life lived before them, shared without ceremony, offered, without demand that the grandfather they never met had written himself into their story. Not through inheritance or tradition or old war stories, but through paper, ink, and the simple choice to reach forward in time and leave the door open. And now, because of that choice, he wasn't just a photo on the mantle anymore. He was a voice in the room, a presence in the quiet, someone who had seen them before they even knew themselves. The letters hadn't always lived in boxes. Years before they became a gift, they had been scattered throughout the house, tucked into cookbooks, between the pages of dusty atlases, inside the sleeves of forgotten record albums. Not because she had hidden them, but because there was never any grand plan. Writing the letters had started as a habit, quiet, private, folded into the rhythm of her ordinary days. She'd write after breakfast, before washing the dishes, or late at night when the windows went dark and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. Some were written in long stretches, whole pages of thoughts pouring out in a single sitting. Others were scribbled in fits and starts, half a thought on a grocery list, an unfinished sentence in the corner of an envelope that had once carried a bill. No one knew she was doing it. Not her son, not her church friends. Not the woman next door who checked in on her once a week with a plastic container of soup and a folded flyer about bingo night. It wasn't a secret so much as something deeply personal, like humming a tune, when no one is home, or dancing in the kitchen with the curtains drawn. These letters were hers, but not forever. They had always been meant for someone else. She just hadn't decided when or how they'd leave her hands. The house had grown quieter in the years since her husband passed. Not just in sound, but in feeling. The echo of footsteps disappeared. The television no longer murmured in the background after dinner, and the calendar stopped filling itself with appointments and errands and anniversaries. But something about the writing kept her tethered, not to the past, but to possibility. She wasn't just recording memories. She was imagining futures. She was placing words into the hands of people who hadn't asked for them yet, because she knew one day they would. One day, Lily would feel like she didn't matter. One day, Owen would doubt himself. One day, someone would need to be reminded of who they were or where they came from, or that they'd been loved fiercely and quietly from the beginning. So she wrote. She used whatever paper she had. Notebook pages with faded blue lines, stationery from a long-closed shop downtown, even the backs of old church bulletins. The envelopes didn't match, and the ink was rarely the same color twice. But each one was dated, each one labeled. Not with instructions, but with gentle invitations. When you feel tired of trying, when no one shows up, when it hurts to speak your mind. No one told her to do it. But once she started, she didn't. She stored some in the back of the linen closet behind a stack of unused pillowcases. Others went into the sewing kit she hadn't opened in years. A few lived in the pockets of winter coats that still hung in the guest room closet. It had never occurred to her to put them all in one place until her knees began to ache more often. And the stairs to the attic felt longer than they used to. One day, she climbed up there with a flashlight and a cardboard box and started to gather. She didn't reread them. Not most of them. She knew what they said, and if the writing was messy or the grammar imperfect, she trusted that the love would translate. That whoever found them wouldn't be looking for polish, but for truth. She came across one letter that she had forgotten entirely. It was dated over a decade ago and labeled simply, "To someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone." There was no name, no specific story, just a page filled with gentle reassurances. You are not the only one feeling this way. Are not weak for needing rest. You are not wrong for hoping it gets better. She held that letter in her hands for a long time before placing it carefully in the box. She didn't know who it would be for yet, but she knew it mattered. It was in that attic, under the slant of the roof and the quiet creak of old beams, that the idea finally took shape. The boxes weren't just storage. They were a form of reaching, a way to gather every piece of quiet, love, and careful attention and place it somewhere it could be found years later. When it was needed most, she spent the next week organizing, sorting the letters not by chronology, but by emotion. She had no formal training in psychology, no degrees or credentials. But she knew about heartbreak. She knew about silence. It's about doubt, about the way the world can overlook you and how long it takes to forgive it for doing so. The shoeboxes she used weren't new. Some were from her husband's old shoes, others from the children's sneakers decades ago. She lined them with scraps of fabric, laid the envelopes down in careful rows, added little note cards to separate the themes. Each time she opened a box to place another letter inside, it felt like she was setting down a piece of herself not to be lost, but to be shared by the end of the month. She had 3 full boxes, each one different in shape, but all carrying the same weight. She labeled them simply with initials L, and one with no label at all. That one would stay with her a while longer. From the outside, nothing had changed. She still woke early, still drank the same weak tea, still fed the birds each morning, and called the pharmacy once a month to refill her blood pressure prescription. The world saw her life as small, as still. But inside those boxes, she was doing something profound. She was archiving a love that didn't need an audience. A record not of history, but of presence. A treasure buried in routine. It wasn't gold. It wasn't flashy. But it was something far rarer: words. Written by someone who had lived enough life to know they might not be there to say them out loud, and someone someday would open those boxes and realize she had been thinking of them the whole time. The fire wasn't large. Not the kind that makes the news or brings neighbors running into the street, but it was real. And for a few minutes, it could have taken everything. It started in the basement. A forgotten extension cord, overworked and poorly placed, sparked against the leg of an old metal shelving unit. She hadn't gone down there much in recent years, not since her knees had begun to creak with the effort of the narrow wooden steps. The basement was mostly storage now. Stacks of holiday decorations, bins of childhood clothes her son had left behind, and boxes that hadn't been opened in decades, including the boxes of letters. She'd moved them down there one spring when her upstairs closet got too full and the guest room needed clearing before Owen and Lily's last overnight visit. At the time, it had seemed practical. The basement stayed cool in the summer and dry in the winter. It's a safe, if slightly forgotten place. She hadn't thought about them again. Not until the smoke alarm shrieked at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been upstairs folding a load of laundry when the smell reached her acrid sharp, like something plastic curling in on itself. For a moment, she thought it was coming from outside. But then the alarm went off, loud and insistent. And she didn't hesitate. She called 911 before she even knew what was burning. Then she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, heart racing, her slippers crunching against the icy sidewalk. Fire truck arrived fast, too fast for her to think of anything but the thud of boots on the porch and the burst of cold air each time a door opened. It wasn't until they let her back inside, hours later, that she remembered. The boxes? She didn't say anything to the fire chief. He was already assuring her that the damage was minimal. A scorched wall, a few melted storage bins. A coil of blackened wiring now carefully coiled into a garbage bag. They'd gotten to it in time. She was lucky, he said. She nodded and smiled, and thanked him, but her mind had already gone elsewhere once they left. She made her way down the basement stairs, one careful step at a time, gripping the handrail as if it might disappear. The smell of smoke still lingered, not heavy, but there. A reminder. The lights had been turned back on, though a few of the bulbs had shattered from the heat. In one corner, the shelf nearest the fire was melted and twisted. Its contents collapsed onto the floor in a blackened pile. Old VHS tapes, a plastic wreath, her husband's toolbox. And beside it, just inches from the damage, sat the boxes. The cardboard was curled at the edges. One had a patch of soot on the lid, but they were intact. She knelt slowly, knees protesting the motion, and opened the first. The letters were still there. The envelopes were singed at the corners, but the ink had held. Her handwriting, shaky and deliberate, stared back at her like a voice returned from the edge. She pulled out the letter on top to Lily. When you need to remember who you are, and held it close to her chest. She sat on the cold concrete floor for a long time, surrounded by the faint smell of smoke and the hiss of a space heater the firefighters had left behind to dry out the air. Her hands trembled, not just from age, but from the weight of what almost happened. She didn't cry, not then, but she did speak softly, to no one in particular. I almost lost you. She said she wasn't talking to the boxers. She was talking to the words inside them. To the future she'd written into being. To the pieces of herself she had preserved for grandchildren who still thought time would never run out. That night, she didn't sleep. She stayed at the kitchen table until dawn. Every letter laid out before her, organized in quiet rows, like soldiers standing at attention. She reread dozens of them, making small notes in the margins when something no longer felt quite right. Replacing a few entirely. Rewriting one from scratch because the original had faded too much. When the sun finally rose, she gathered the boxes. Again, but this time, she did not return them to the basement. She placed them upstairs, in the hall closet right behind the winter coats, where they were easy to reach. She lined the shelf with plastic in case of another leak, tucked in a lavender sachet to keep the air fresh, and slid the boxes into place like setting stones into the foundation of a home. From that day forward, she never treated the letters as a side project again. They became a responsibility, a promise she had nearly broken by accident. Not through neglect, but through the quiet lie of delay. That there would always be more time. That tomorrow was guaranteed. The fire had taught her otherwise, so she began to prepare, to organize, to wrap them and, for the first time, to consider giving them away, not after she was gone, but while she was still here to see them opened, while she could still explain the smudges, still remember why she chose certain words, still feel what it meant to be heard. The letters had almost become ashdot, but now they would become something else. A legacy not of wealth or achievement or tradition, but of thought, of care, of love, layered one envelope at a time, saved not in a vault or a will, but in the soft spaces of memory. And if someday her grandchildren told the story of that fire, she hoped they would remember this part, not the fear, but the rescue, that what mattered most had survived. And because of that, it could finally be shared. There had always been letters. That's how it began. Really, long before. The boxes, before the careful labeling and quiet sorting. Before the idea that words could outlive the person writing them, there were just letters. Folded and creased, postmarked with faraway places. And written in a handwriting she'd memorized. Long before she ever read a single word of it. He had started writing to her in the fall of 1967, just a few months after being deployed. The first one came from a field post in Germany. It arrived on a Tuesday. She remembered because it had rained that morning, and she nearly didn't check the mailbox until after dinner. It was a single sheet of paper, folded in half, sealed with tape instead of an envelope. No return address, just his initials and a military number scrawled along the top. Still here, the note read. Still me. That was it. She had stared at it for a long time before tucking it into the back of the cookbook. She used most page 212, the molasses bread recipe she knew by heart. Not because it belonged there, but because it felt safer between familiar things. More letters followed, slowly, then more regularly. He sent them from barracks, from tents, from borrowed desks in shared offices, even once from the inside of a mess tin lid when he ran out of paper. She never knew when they'd arrive. Some came weeks apart. Others landed 2 or 3 in the same week, as if the post office had finally caught its breath. They weren't love letters in the way people imagine them. Not flowery, not poetic, but real. Full of small observations and inside jokes and memories that tethered them across oceans. He wrote about the way the light hit the hills near his station, how the coffee in the canteen always tasted slightly burnt, how he missed the way she folded towels, and how strange that was to miss. Sometimes he described the quiet between drills. Other times he skipped the details entirely and just wrote about home, asking if the lilac bush had bloomed, if the neighbor's dog was still barking at passing cars, if her knees had stopped aching when the weather turned cold. She wrote back. Every time, her letters were longer. Rambling, sometimes. Full of updates he probably didn't need, but she wanted him to have. He carried them folded in his shirt pocket, creased and softened from rereading. One letter he sent during his second. Winter overseas arrived with a pressed flower inside dried and delicate, flattened between 2 sheets of tissue. He wrote only one line beside it. Found this near the fence. Thought it looked like you. She had placed that flower inside her diary and never told anyone. Not her sisters, not her son. It was still there, years later when she opened the book, to look for something else and found it waiting, color faded. Edges frayed but intact. Later letters came from quieter places. Posts with fewer patrols and more routine. He wrote more about ideas then, about books he was reading, about the future, about what he hoped for. Never said it aloud, but she could sense when the danger grew closer. His words got shorter, sentences clipped. He stopped signing them with his full name and instead wrote only, yours. Always. She saved every one. She kept them in a small cedar box under the bed, stacked in bundles tied with ribbon from grocery store packages. The ink bled on a few. One had a burn mark in the corner, something about a stove being too close to the envelope pile. But she never threw a single one away. After he came home, the letters stopped. Not out of forgetfulness, just out of proximity. They were together again, so words could be spoken instead of mailed. But the absence of those letters left a kind of quiet in the house that she didn't recognize at first, and then one day he handed her another folded in half. No envelope, just her name on the front, written in the same firm handwriting he'd used overseas. I missed writing to you, he said. She smiled, holding the paper like a memory returned. So he kept going. Not daily, not even weekly. But sometimes she'd find one slipped into her coat pocket, or taped to the fridge, or resting beside her morning mug with the word read scrawled beside a smudged heart. They weren't letters anymore. Not exactly. They were pieces of him, shared in real time, a way of staying close even in the ordinary. When he got sick, he asked her to bring him the old cedar box. "I want to read them again," he said, and he did. Every single one. Sometimes out loud, sometimes just to himself. He'd pause and smile. At a line he had forgotten. Once he teared up reading a description of the smell of her hair after rain. "I must have really missed you," he said with a quiet laugh. She wrote one final letter to him the night after he passed. Not out of ritual, not for closure, but because she didn't know how to stop. It wasn't long. It's just a few lines on thick paper. "You stayed with me longer than you promised, and I will keep you longer than I ever thought possible." She sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the cedar box, now resting beside the others. But she didn't leave it there forever. Years later, when she started writing to Owen and Lily, she took the box out again. Not to copy the words, but to remember how it had felt. To receive something written just for you. To read something and know, without question, that you were loved. That's what she tried to give them. Not instructions, not expectations, just presence. Folded neatly, sealed quietly. Written not from overseas, but from across time. Because some distances you can't cross by travel alone. Some are bridged only by words. There was one letter that never made it into the box. For years, it stayed tucked into the pages of a book neither of them ever finished reading. The book had sat on their nightstand through seasons and seasons, its spine softening, bookmark unmoved. It was only after his funeral, when she finally found the courage to clear their bedroom, that she came across it. The book was a novel he'd picked up at the airport once, its cover creased from being wedged into his coat pocket during a layover. She had forgotten all about it. Forgotten, too, that he'd started underlining things in pencil, just small passages, stray thoughts. That's what drew her back to it. The underlines, the soft, ghost-like graphite markings beside certain phrases. "The world is quieter than I expected. Love is what survives the forgetting." She had been about to place the book in the box for donation when a slip of paper fell out. It wasn't folded like the others. Not sealed, not labeled. Just a single page, handwritten. Neat but hurried. No greeting, no signature. Just words. At first, she thought it was a draft, or something he'd meant to copy clean later. But the further she read, the more she understood was different. This letter wasn't for her. It was for Owen. Not baby Owen. Not toddler Owen with sticky fingers and a laugh that filled up every room. But Owen grown, a young man he would never meet. A version he could only imagine. She read it twice before she set it down. Then she read it again. Asterisk. "I don't know who you are yet, but I think about you a lot. I think about the moment you realize the world isn't always fair. And it isn't always kind. And it won't always reward your efforts. I think about how I won't be there when that moment happens, and how badly I wish I could be. But more than anything, I think about what I would say if I were sitting beside you when it does. I'd say, you were never meant to fit into something small, and I'd mean it. You might feel out of place, even in your own skin for a while. You might try to shrink, to get quieter, sharper, more agreeable. Don't be honest. Be good. Be stubborn. When it counts, be someone your own children would look up to, not for what you have, but for how you carry what you don't." Asterisk. That was where the letter ended. The pencil mark faded at the edge of the page, the sentence unfinished. She held the letter in her lap for a long time that evening, unsure what to do. It didn't have a date. It didn't have a place among the others. It wasn't labeled with a tidy phrase like "when you feel lost" or "when things go wrong." It was raw, unfiltered, a fragment, not a chapter. She thought of leaving it where she found it, tucked in the pages. Hidden away again, but something about it felt too urgent, too necessary. So she copied it. She wrote the words out carefully on a new sheet of paper, tracing each line as if she were listening for the sound of his voice through the ink. She added a title gently in her own handwriting to Owen. From the grandfather who never got to finish this. She placed it in his box, just behind the others. That Christmas morning, when Owen pulled it from the stack, he paused. It didn't match. The rest? Different paper. 2 handwritings. He turned it over, puzzled, then slowly opened it. He read the first line, then the second. And by the third, his hand moved to his mouth just slightly, not to stifle a sound, but to ground himself. Like something inside him had shifted, tilted, and he needed to hold still to keep it from sliding too far when he reached the end. When he saw the unfinished sentence, he looked up. "It just stops," he said. His grandmother nodded. "I think." "That was the last thing he wrote," she said. "He didn't sign it." "No," she replied, "but he didn't have to." Lily leaned over, reading the letter silently over his shoulder. "It's strange," she said. "It feels like he's here." Owen didn't speak right away. He placed the letter gently back in the envelope and held it for a moment against his chest, as if the warmth of his heartbeat might settle something into place. "It's like he knew," he said at last. "He didn't know me, but he knew me." His grandmother looked at him then, not the boy who had rolled his eyes at duct-taped wrapping paper or slumped in his chair during small talk, but the young man who had sat quietly, reading letter after letter from people who loved him without conditions. "He thought about you every day," she said. "He used to talk about what you'd be like, what kind of man you'd become. They was always trying to leave something behind, just in case." Owen didn't say anything else. He placed the letter back in the box and closed the lid knot to hide it, but to protect it. Later, when the day had stretched into afternoon and the house began to feel like a home again, he found himself alone for a moment in the hallway, looking at the old photograph of his grandfather in uniform. For the first time, he didn't just see the man. He saw the mind behind the eyes, the hand that had held the pencil, the thoughts that had reached across decades to meet him exactly where he was. He raised a hand to the frame, not a salute, just a gesture, quiet and human. And then he whispered, "I'll finish the sentence," because that's what the letter had really given him. Not closure, but continuation. The living room had grown dim again by late afternoon. It's a kind of quiet that settles in after the gifts have been opened, that dishes washed and the laughter faded into a soft hush. The tree lights blinked steadily, casting long shadows across the floor. No one said it aloud, but everyone seemed to know. Something was different this year. Lily sat cross-legged on the rug, flipping slowly through the letters she hadn't yet read. Owen had moved to the couch, holding a mug that had long since gone. Cold, the same one he'd used since he was a kid, the chipped green ceramic one with the snowman faded to a ghost. Their father was still in the kitchen, talking in low tones to someone on the phone. And their grandmother remained in her armchair, hands resting lightly on the armrests, eyes watching them, but not intrusively. Just watching the way she always had. It was Lily who opened the envelope first. The one labeled, "When you think no one else has felt this way." She didn't know what she expected, comforting words, maybe some wise sentiment. But the first line stopped her. "There are things I've never told anyone." She looked up, met her grandmother's gaze. For a moment, it was hard to imagine that sentence belonging to this woman, this gentle figure who never raised her voice, who baked with exact measurements, who remembered birthdays without checking a calendar. But the letter continued. "When I was 17, I got engaged to someone no one in the family knew. He was older, a boy from the next town over. No, we were going to run away together. He had a job lined up in Chicago, a one-room apartment, and a plan for a life that was never meant to happen." Lily blinked, surprised. She'd never heard even a hint of this. Her grandmother had never mentioned another man, another life, another version of who she might have been. "We didn't leave. I backed out 2 days before. He never forgave me. Neither did I for a while. I buried the memory like it was something shameful, But now I realize it was just a moment, a human moment. One of many. There was more. I lost a baby once. No one knows I was 8 weeks along. I hadn't told your grandfather yet. I cried in the bathroom with the door locked and flushed away a version of the future I had already imagined in full color. I told myself it didn't count, that it was too early to mourn. But it did count, and I did mourn. Just quietly, Lily. Felt her throat tightened out. There were days I didn't want to be married. Days I didn't want to be a mother. Days when I sat in the car in the grocery store parking lot and thought about driving somewhere else and starting over. But I didn't. Not because I was strong, but because I believed things could get better. And they did. Slowly, imperfectly. But they did. She didn't realize she was crying until Owen leaned over and passed her a tissue. "What is it?" he asked gently. "She's single quotes, us, ... double quotes." Lily hesitated. "She's telling me things I didn't think grandmothers were allowed to say." Owen reached for one of his own envelopes, suddenly more curious than before. Their grandmother sat silently across the room, not smiling, not crying, just present. She had lived with these stories folded inside her for decades, like fragile notes kept in a coat pocket that no one ever asked to see. There was another letter in Lily's box, one marked, "For when you feel ashamed of your thoughts." It began with, "You don't have to earn your place in this family by being perfect." She opened a third, then a fourth, each one more vulnerable than the last. Not dramatic confessions, not scandalous revelations, but small truths. The kind people carry quietly, not because they want to, but because no one ever asked if they had something to share. Owen looked up from his own letter. "She wrote about feeling invisible at work," he said softly. Back when she worked in the library, Lily wiped her face with her sleeve. "She said she used to get nervous around other moms at PTA meetings. Thought she wasn't interesting enough." Owen nodded slowly. "She said she was scared to retire. Afraid she wouldn't matter anymore?" Neither of them had ever imagined her like that. She had always seemed so certain, so comfortable in her routines. But here, in the soft loops of her handwriting, was someone else entirely. Someone who had questioned herself, who had longed for more, who had doubted and regretted and forgiven herself in small, quiet ways. Lily folded her letters and placed them back in the box. Almost reverently. She wrote like she wasn't trying to teach us something, she said. She was just telling the truth. Owen looked at their grandmother again. "Why now?" he asked. "Why give us these now?" She leaned forward slowly, hands clasped. "Because I'm still here," she said. "And I wanted you to know who I really am while I still have time to answer your questions." Lily stared at her. "But why didn't you ever say these things before?" Her grandmother smiled gently. "'Cause I thought I was supposed to be strong and quiet and certain. But getting older, it makes you realize that strength without truth is just distance. And I didn't want to be distant anymore." Room was silent again. But now the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence, like breath, like the weight of generations being handed over. Not in lecture or legacy, but in something far more human. And Lily understood, maybe for the first time, that her grandmother's greatest gift wasn't wisdom, it was honesty, folded neatly, shared, slowly offered without shame, and it was enough. There was only one envelope in the entire box that wasn't sealed. It rested on top, unmarked, a bit thicker. Then the others. Lily noticed it first. She picked it up, turned it over, then opened the flap gently, as if expecting something fragile inside. What she pulled out was not a letter, it was a photograph. The paper had yellowed with time. The edges curled softly inward, and a faint crease ran diagonally through the middle, like someone had once folded it and then carefully straightened it. Out again, it was black and white, slightly faded. Two figures stood in the center, their heads touching. A man and a woman young, smiling in a way that didn't look posed. The woman wore a scarf around her neck, wind catching the edge of her coat. The man's hand rested gently at the small of her back, his fingers just barely visible. Lily stared at it for a long time, her brow furrowed. "This is them," she said quietly. "Grandma and Grandpa." Owen leaned closer, peering over her shoulder. "I've never seen this one. Neither have I." They looked toward the armchair where their grandmother now sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching them. She didn't speak, just nodded slightly, giving them permission to keep going. There was a second item inside the envelope. A small, folded sheet of lined paper, not dated, not labeled. Just a few paragraphs in her handwriting, slightly younger, steadier than the letters they'd read that day. The ink had bled faintly through the paper. At the bottom, there was a single signature, just her first name. Lily unfolded it and began reading aloud. "This photo was taken 2 weeks before we got engaged. Your grandfather had just come back from a short assignment upstate. I picked him up from the bus station. It was cold and muddy, and I remember my boots sinking into the ground as we walked. He took this picture with a camera he'd borrowed. He kept adjusting the settings because he said the light wasn't right. But I think he just wanted to delay the goodbye." Owen leaned closer, staring at the photo again. "She's younger than I imagined." "She's barely older than we are," Lily whispered. "We didn't have a lot of pictures together," she continued. "We couldn't afford film very often. And later, when we could, we were always behind the camera taking pictures of your father, of the house, of birthdays and holidays. But this one felt like us." There was a pause in the letter, then a shift. "He carried this photograph in his wallet for years. I didn't even know, not until he was in the hospital and the nurse handed me his things in a plastic bag. The corners were worn down to nothing. I could barely tell what it was, but I knew. I knew because of the way I was looking at him. Like, the whole world could go quiet and I'd still hear him breathe." Lily's voice caught slightly as she read that line. She continued, softer now. "I'm giving it to you because someday you'll have your own photo. Not necessarily of a person, maybe of a place or a moment. Maybe even something blurry or badly lit. But you'll look at it and remember who you were before life asked you to become someone else. Keep it safe. It matters more than you'll realize." Lily folded the paper again. Carefully. Owen reached for the photo, turning it gently in his hands. "She looks happy," he said. "I mean, really happy." She was, their grandmother said. Her voice was quiet, steady. We didn't have much, but we had that moment." "Did you think about giving it to Dad?" Lily asked. "I thought about it," she replied. "But it wasn't meant for him. He had other pieces of us. He lived it." "But you?" She stopped for a moment, searching for the right words. "You're still learning who you come from." There was something grounding about the photo. Something that made both of them sit a little differently. It wasn't a portrait meant for display. There were no polished smiles or matching sweaters. Just two people caught mid-laughter, unaware of the camera, unaware of the decades that would follow. Lily held it up one last time, then passed it to Owen. "Maybe we should frame it," she said. "Not yet," Owen replied. "Let's keep it with the letters for now." Their grandmother nodded. "That's where it belongs." And so it returned to the box, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, just slipped quietly between the envelopes, where the paper could breathe beside the words, long after the gifts were unwrapped and the leftovers packed away. The photo stayed on Lily's mind. It wasn't just the image, it was what it revealed. It's the soft part of history that doesn't make it into stories. The truth behind the timelines and family trees. The fact that before their grandparents were parents or even a couple, they were two young people, trying to figure out if they were brave enough to say yes to forever. And they had. Not perfectly. Not easily, but completely. And that one photograph creased quiet. Real was all the proof they needed. It was nearing evening by the time the living room began to empty. The gifts had been opened, the pies had been served, and the once bustling noise of Christmas Day had softened into something quieter, familiar. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, and the windows glowed with the last hints of winter light, the snow outside untouched since morning. Owen lingered by the fireplace, alone now except for the flickering lights on the tree and the quiet rustle of his grandmother's knitting needles across the room. He hadn't said much in the last hour. Not since reading the letter from his grandfather. Not since tracing the outline of that yellowed photograph with his thumb. Something inside him had shifted quietly, but undeniably. He held one of the envelopes in his hand, now unopened. He hadn't decided whether to read it yet. It was labeled for when you think you've let someone down, and though he hadn't opened it, he already felt the words inside waiting for him, words he wasn't sure he deserved. He looked over at his grandmother. She was still in her chair, the same soft cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes focused on the yarn between her fingers. She hadn't asked him how he felt. She hadn't asked what he thought of the letters or if he planned to keep them. She hadn't asked for anything at all, and that somehow made it worse. He stood slowly, letters still in hand, and crossed the room with uncertain steps. "Can I sit here?" he asked, gesturing to the footstool by her chair. She looked up, surprised, but smiled. Of course. Sat, elbows on his knees, the envelope resting loosely in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence wasn't heavy, just careful. Then, finally, he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't react at first, just watched him gently, waiting, for before. "For every time I laughed at something you gave me, for rushing through visits, for acting like I had better things to do." He paused. "For not seeing you, really seeing you." Her knitting slowed, then stopped. She set the needles down in her lap. "You were a child, Owen," she said softly. "You were busy growing up. That's how it works." He shook his head. "It doesn't excuse it." "It didn't hurt me," she said. "But I made you small," he replied. "And you were never small." That made her pause. She tilted her head slightly, as if hearing something she hadn't expected. "I didn't think you noticed," she said. "I didn't," he admitted. "Not then. I just assumed you were always ... there. Like the tree at Christmas. Like the house itself." She smiled faintly. "I liked being that too." He looked down at the envelope in his hand. "I haven't opened this one yet." "You don't have to," she said. "It'll wait. But I think I already know what it says," he added. "I think I've already lived the moment it was written for. And maybe it's already done its work, eh?" Looked up at her again. There was something new in his eyes. Something unguarded. "I'm sorry for all the things I didn't say sooner." She reached out then, resting her hand over his. "You're saying them now?" she whispered. They sat like that for a while, 2 generations connected not by obligation, but by understanding. By choice. He didn't cry. Not then, but he felt. The kind of emotion that settles deeper than tears. It's the kind that stays in your chest for a long time after. It's reminding you to live differently after a while. He stood. "I'm going to keep the box," he said. "I hoped you would." He turned to go, then paused. "Do you think Grandpa knew how much this would matter?" She nodded slowly. He didn't write for recognition. He wrote because it was what he had to give. Owen looked down at the envelope again. "That's what I want to do, to find a way to give something back." She smiled then, not gently, but proudly. "You just did." And with that, he returned to the couch, the envelope still unopened. But somehow already read, because some letters don't need to be unfolded to be understood. Some apologies don't need to be spoken loudly to be heard. And some moments, shared in quiet, last longer than the loudest ones ever could. The morning after the funeral had been too bright. She remembered that. The sun had come up without hesitation, casting its golden light across the frost-covered lawn like nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't changed. As if the man she'd woken up beside for nearly 4 decades hadn't. been carried out of the house just 2 days before. The quiet had been unbearable. She had walked from room to room, unsure of what she was looking for. His slippers were still beside the bed, his coat still hung on the hook by the door, his toothbrush still in the cup on the sink, a faint smear of shaving cream still on the mirror. It was as if he might return at any moment, as if he had just stepped out for milk and would be back before the coffee cooled. But he wouldn't. She had sat down at the kitchen table and reached instinctively for a pen. There was no plan, no audience. Just an ache in her chest that wouldn't move unless it became words. She pulled a sheet of stationery from the drawer blue with a faint border of pressed flowers in, began to write. Dear you, so quiet I can hear the walls breathing. I keep thinking I'll hear your steps in the hallway, your cough before you speak, but all I hear is the furnace kicking on and the birds outside, who didn't get the message that something has gone missing from this house. That was the first letter she wrote to him after he was gone. It wouldn't be the last. Over the next few months, she wrote dozens more. Some just a few lines, some several pages. Some angry, others wistful. All honest. She didn't write them to keep him close. She wrote them because she didn't know how to be in the world without saying things to him. She wrote them because grief needed a place to go, and so she gave it paper. She wrote to him about small things, the weather, the state of the garden, the way the neighbor's dog kept digging under the fence again. But she also wrote the things she never got to say out loud, about how scared she had been during his surgery, about how after his diagnosis she would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his breaths. She told him she was angry too, that she hated how quickly time could change its rules, that she resented how everyone around her kept moving forward while she remained suspended in a version of life that had been paused mid-sentence. Sometimes she left the letters in the drawer. Other times she folded them carefully and placed them in the cedar box with the others. A few were tucked inside Books' books, like she was planting them for him to find. One day, she caught herself laughing, alone at the sink, remembering something he once said about the way she peeled oranges. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. Then she cried. That night she wrote again. You wouldn't believe it, I laughed today. Not a polite laugh. Either a real one, the kind that starts in your stomach and shakes the whole room. I forgot for a moment that you were gone. I remembered what it was like to be happy with you instead of just lonely for you. I don't know what that means yet, but I think you'd be proud of me. It was that letter, simple, quiet, that became the first one she copied into Lily's box. Not because it was profound, but because it marked a shift. A moment where grief stopped being just an absence and started becoming something else. A companion, maybe. A shadow that no longer frightened her. Lily had found it near the bottom of the stack. The envelope wasn't labeled with advice. It didn't say for when you're sad or for when you lose someone. It was just addressed plainly to Lily, because I want you to know how. I kept going. She had opened it while sitting cross-legged on the floor, the light from the Christmas tree casting golden dots across the envelope. She had expected something. Gentle, what she found was raw. The voice in the letter wasn't the one she knew from holidays and hugs and cookies. It was the voice of someone who had stood at the edge of something deep and dark and decided not to fall in it. Her grandmother wrote of waking up alone, of making a single cup of coffee, of going days without speaking aloud. But she also wrote about finding a new rhythm, a slower one, a quieter one. A life still filled with meaning, even when the person she loved most was no longer there to share. She wrote about making herself a new promise that she would keep loving, even if it meant loving differently. And then near the end of the letter was this. One day, you will lose someone you thought you could not live without. When that day comes, I want you to remember this. You do not have to be okay right away. You just have to stay open to the possibility that one day you might be. Lily had cried reading that, not because she had lost someone, but because she knew, now, what her grandmother had carried. And she understood that the most powerful words she'd ever received weren't written to instruct her. They were written to accompany her, even into the dark, even when the writer herself had no answers, only love. And sometimes that was more than enough. It was tucked between two longer letters written on thinner paper than the rest. Lily nearly missed it. The envelope didn't have a neat label, no advice, no comforting instruction. Just 7 words scrawled across the front in her grandmother's familiar hand. I wasn't always this old, you know. She almost smiled when she read it. Almost, she looked up. Her grandmother had dozed off slightly in her chair, her chin resting softly against her scarf, her breathing slow and steady. Owen was flipping through his own letters across the room, now surrounded by a scattered pile that he seemed reluctant to pack away. Just yet, Lily slipped the letter from its envelope and unfolded it. I wasn't always this old, you know. Wasn't always the one reminding people to wear a coat, or asking for help with the TV remote, or making lists because I can't remember why I walked into a room. I wasn't always the one people held the door for, or talked about in past tense at holiday tables when they think I can't hear. She paused, eyes lingering on that line. There was a time when I drove too fast down back roads with the windows down and music turned all the way up. A time when I didn't leave the house without eyeliner. When I danced barefoot in parking lots at night. When I stayed out too late with people whose last names I didn't know, laughing until my ribs hurt. I've jumped into cold lakes without a second thought. I've cried in restaurants. I've fallen in love in public libraries. Lily blinked. She wasn't sure what she had expected. But it wasn't this. You look at me now and see a woman who measures her days in teaspoons in grocery store circulars. But you weren't there the night I broke into an abandoned greenhouse with my best friend just to see what bloomed under the moonlight. You weren't there when I sang in a bar in Cleveland on a dare, or when I got lost in Paris because I was too proud to ask for directions. I wasn't always careful. I wasn't always certain, but I was always full. She turned the letter over. There was more. I know you see me as someone safe, predictable, maybe even boring. I don't blame you. We all think old people were born that way. But the truth is, I've lived more versions of myself than I can count. And I loved them all, Evan, the messy ones, especially the messy ones. They taught me who I could be before the world decided who I should be. Lily felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. It wasn't grief, not quite. It was something closer to recognition. A collision between who her grandmother had always been and the woman now dozing beside the Christmas tree with a blanket. Draped across her lap, there's a version of me you'll never meet. She's the one who danced in her kitchen at midnight and drove 3 hours to see someone she wasn't supposed to miss. The one who lost her temper and forgave too easily and once cut her own hair with kitchen scissors just because she needed something to feel different. She was wild, keen, and scared, and brilliant in ways no one noticed at the time. There was one more paragraph, written in slightly shakier handwriting. You don't have to remember all of this, but I hope you'll understand one day when you feel yourself changing. When you look in the mirror and realize you've started to become someone new, that you're allowed to be more than one thing in this life, right? And that growing older doesn't mean losing who you were. It just means folding those people into who you've become. Lily read the letter 3 times before folding it gently and placing it back in the envelope. She didn't move for a long while. She simply sat there, looking at her grandmother, not the older woman she'd known from Sunday visits and Christmas mornings, but someone else entirely. A girl with wind in her hair, a woman with bare feet on a tile floor, someone who had broken rules and hearts and routines. I didn't know, she said aloud. Barely a whisper. Her grandmother stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Didn't know what, sweetheart? That you were ... like that? Her grandmother chuckled low and warm. Most people don't. Lily hesitated. Why didn't you tell us? She smiled. Because you were busy being young. And I was busy letting you. Lily reached for her grandmother's hand. I wish I could have seen you then. Her grandmother's fingers closed gently around hers. You just did. And in that simple moment, hand in hand, letter between them, Lily felt something shift. Not just how she saw her grandmother, but how she saw what it meant to grow older, to change. To become and to still carry within you every version of yourself you've ever been. The room had gone still again. It's the way it does after a long day begins. To settle into evening, the kind of stillness that carries weight. Not silence, but presence. Soft hum beneath everything. Owen and Lily had stopped reading aloud. The pile of opened envelopes now rested in quiet stacks on the coffee table. Handled with the kind of care usually reserved for heirlooms or church hymnals. And yet, there was still one envelope left. Lily had noticed it early on, but left it alone, tucked beneath the others in her box. It looked different. Not just older, though the paper had yellowed and the seal had begun to peel slightly but heavier. As if what lay inside wasn't paper at all, but something thicker, denser. A truth, perhaps. Or a question. Unlike the others, this one bore no label, no hint of when or why it should be opened. Just her name, written in long looping script. No instructions, no date. No occasion. She had almost forgotten about it, but now, as the sky darkened outside and the lights from the tree reflected gently in the window, she pulled it from the box. Owen glanced up. Another one. She nodded. The last. She turned it over in her hands. There was a small strip of tape along the back, clearly added later, maybe to reinforce a seal that had begun to fail. She peeled it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a small card, no bigger than a postcard. On the front was a photograph not of a person, but a place. A quiet stretch of beach, the kind with pale sand and a crooked fence running alongside the dunes. She recognized it instantly, even though it had been years. That's from our trip to the coast, Lily said. I was 7. Her grandmother nodded. Your grandfather took it. She turned the card over. There was a single sentence written in black ink. It's just 7 words. Open when you're ready to leave. Lily frowned. Leave? She looked up at her grandmother, who didn't offer an explanation, just that same patient, knowing gaze she had worn all day. Owen leaned forward. What does that mean? Lily looked back at the card. There was nothing else. No signature. No date. No further instruction. She exhaled slowly, then turned the card back over and read the words again. Open when you're ready to leave. It didn't make sense at first. She wasn't going anywhere. Not that she knew of. She was still in school, still living at home, still figuring herself out. But the phrase stirred something inside her. Something not quite understood, but deeply familiar. And then it clicked. It wasn't about a physical place. It was about a moment, a season, a version of herself, leaving a fear, leaving a silence, leaving behind the girl who hadn't yet seen what she was capable of. She thought of the last few months, how she'd stopped drawing, how she'd hidden her sketchbooks in her closet, convinced that she had nothing left to say. How she'd told herself she was ordinary, that everyone else had already taken the good ideas. She looked at the photograph again. It was the same beach where she had once run, barefoot and shrieking, chasing seagulls with her grandfather while her grandmother watched from a blanket, laughing. She remembered that day, how free she had felt. Before comparisons, before hesitation. Before she began doubting the way her hands moved across the page, the letter wasn't a farewell. It was an invitation. She looked up again. Her grandmother smiled. I didn't know what to write. She said, I didn't know when you'd need it, just that you would. Lily nodded, eyes glistening. I think I'm ready, she said. For what? Owen asked, genuinely curious. Lily didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window, holding the card up so the light from the tree shone through it. She traced the dunes in the photograph with her finger. Then she turned and looked at them both. To begin, she said, and it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. It was quiet. Resolute. Her grandmother leaned back in her chair, satisfied. Owen smiled faintly. We should keep all of these somewhere safe. Lily nodded. Not locked away, just ... accessible. They sat together then, the three of them. No more letters left. No more envelopes to unfold. But somehow, nothing felt finished. If anything, it felt like something was just starting. Like the space the letters had opened between them was wide enough now for something new to grow. Because the last envelope hadn't been a conclusion. It had been a threshold. And Lily had crossed it without even knowing she had. The boxes didn't go back under the tree. They didn't end up in storage with the ornaments or tucked away in some attic drawer, alongside old photographs and brittle holiday cards. Instead, they stayed out on the coffee table in the open, where anyone could reach them. No one said it aloud, but it became understood. These weren't just gifts. They were conversations. Ongoing ones. The kind that don't end with a thank you or a hug at the door. The kind that change how a room feels, even when no one is speaking. By the next morning, Owen had gone through his letters again. Slower this time. He laid them out in front of him and read them not as instructions, but as reflections. A mirror held up by someone who had known him since birth, but who, it turned out, had never stopped seeing more in him than he saw in himself. One letter had said simply, "You're not falling behind. You're just beginning your own pace." Another, "You have permission to rest even when the world keeps moving." He didn't even know he needed those words until he read them. But now they echoed everywhere in his chest, in the back of his mind. In the way he stood a little straighter that morning. Lily, too, read hers again. She had taken to carrying one of the shorter notes in her coat pocket. The paper had started to wear at the corners. It read, "The part of you that feels too soft for this world is the part I'm proudest of." She didn't tell anyone. She kept it close. She didn't need to. That afternoon, their father came into the room. He hadn't read many of the letters. He'd sat in the kitchen during most of the unwrapping, quietly nursing his coffee and watching from a distance. But now, he picked up one of the boxes and sat down. "May I?" he asked Dot, their grandmother, seated in her usual chair. Simply nodded. He opened the lid and pulled out one of the envelopes at random. It was addressed to him. "For when you're afraid you're doing it wrong." He read it silently, his thumb brushing over each word as though they might vanish if he wasn't careful. His expression didn't change much, but when he finished, he folded the paper gently and held it for a moment before slipping it back into the envelope. "She wrote this before." He trailed off. "She knew what we'd need," Owen said. "She always did," their father replied. It was then that they made a quiet decision, not with words, but with action. The boxes would stay open. They rearranged the space around the coffee table so that the lids rested upright, the envelopes leaning slightly forward as if they were waiting for someone to reach for them again. The letters became part of the furniture, as normal as the coasters or the folded blankets or the smell of cinnamon that still lingered from the fine K's. People came and went in the days that followed. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Some opened envelopes. Others sat in silence and stared at the handwriting, unsure what to say. No one was rushed. No one was told which letter to choose. That was the beauty of it. The box offered what people were. Ready to receive dawn no more. One cousin read only one note, then left in tears. Hugging their grandmother tightly at the door, another returned 3 times over the week. Each visit longer than the last, each time picking a different envelope. No one asked what she read. No one needed to Dot. Lily found herself writing to Dot at first. Just little thoughts on scrap paper, things she didn't want to forget. Then full pages in her journal. Sometimes directly to her grandmother, sometimes to herself. For the first time in a long while, her thoughts felt steady again. Like she wasn't just capturing them, but honoring them. She even began to sketch. Again, not for school, not for praise. Just because her hands remembered how Owen began calling his grandmother more often. Not just on holidays or birthdays, but on random Tuesdays. He'd call after work while standing in the parking lot. 1. Foot on the bumper of his car just to ask how her day had been. She always answered, and the box remained. A little faded now. The corners softened, the envelopes no longer perfectly aligned. But it stayed, week after week, on the table. Not because they didn't know where else to put it, but because they no longer wanted to put it away. Sometimes Lily would glance at it while passing through the room and feel something settle in her chest. A reassurance, a presence, not magic, not mystery. Just memory, made physical. Wisdom made reachable. Her grandmother never called attention to it. She never added to it. Either not that they knew of. She didn't need to. What had been given was already enough. What remained wasn't just paper and ink. It was a way of being, quiet permission to feel, to falter, to begin again. And so the box stayed open, not as a relic, but as a reminder that the words we leave behind don't need to be perfect. They only need to be honest and offered while we still can. It was a rainy Wednesday in early spring when Owen called. Not a holiday, not an anniversary. Just one of those days when the sky had forgotten how to be anything but gray. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Hi, Grandma," he said, voice calm but uncertain. She smiled at the sound of him. "Well, this is a nice surprise." There was a pause, the kind that holds something. "I was just wondering," he said slowly, "why you did it. The letters, the boxes, everything." She didn't answer right away. She stood in her kitchen, one hand resting on the countertop, the other holding the phone to her ear. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the window pane. "Do you have time for a little story?" she asked. "Always," Owen said. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same place she had written the first letter years ago. "I was 17, she began, "and I had just had my heart broken for the first time. Silly, really? A boy with good cheekbones and a bad sense of timing. I came home crying, convinced my life was over." "I can't imagine you heartbroken," Owen said. "Oh, I was dramatic," she chuckled, sobbing into my pillow like the world had ended. "And your great-grandmother, my mother, she didn't say much. She just left a note by my bed. What did it say?" She paused. "It said, 'You'll feel better after pancakes and sleep.'" Owen laughed. That's it," she said. "And I did. I woke up the next day, ate pancakes, and moved on. But that note, I kept it. I still have it." He was quiet for a moment. "So that's why. Because of one note." "No," she said softly. "That's where it began." She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting to the window. "As I got older, I realized that most people don't remember the big speeches. They remember the small, quiet things, the kindnesses that come without fanfare. A note on a bad day, a hand on your back when you feel like disappearing." She heard him exhale on the other end. "I didn't know what to give you," she said. "Not really. You and Lily are living in a world I don't fully understand, so I gave you the only thing I knew how to give myself. My words, my memory, my mistakes, my voice on paper." She paused. "I wanted you to know I was more than just the lady who made cookies and reminded you to call home. I wanted you to have something you could open when I wasn't there. Something that wouldn't ask anything of you, just meet you where you are." There was silence again, but not the empty kind. Then Owen spoke. "You know, I never said thank you properly." "You don't have to," she said. "You opened the letters. It's all I ever hoped for. Been reading them again," he admitted. "It feels different now, like I'm hearing them with new ears." "You are," she replied, "because you're different now. That's how it works." Owen hesitated. "Do you think I could write some? Not like yours, but maybe for someone?" "Someday," she smiled. "Of course you can. That's the whole point. We pass it on." He exhaled again, slower this time. "Thank you," he said. "Finally, you're welcome, sweetheart." They didn't say goodbye right away, okay? They talked about other things, about the weather, the birds returning to the feeder, the book she had just finished, but the question had already been answered. Not just for Owen, for her too, because all those years, all those quiet mornings spent writing when no one else was awake, she had never been sure if it would matter. She had only hoped it might. And now, on a rainy Wednesday, her grandson had called not to ask for help, but to understand. And that, more than anything, told her the letters had done their job. They hadn't solved anything. They had simply made room for someone to ask why. And sometimes that's how everything begins. The box was still on the table. By then, the tree had been taken down, the pine needles swept into neat little piles, the ribbon and leftover wrapping stored away until next year. Life had resumed its usual rhythm school runs, work calls, grocery lists. But the box remained, untouched yet never forgotten. It had become part of the house, like the old grandfather clock that chimed 5 minutes late, or the crooked frame in the hallway no one ever straightened. Familiar, constant. But then one afternoon in late January, Lily placed something inside. In not an envelope she had received, but one she had written. She didn't say anything when she did it. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a folded piece of cream paper sealed in an envelope that said in her neat handwriting, "For Grandma." For no reason in particular, Owen noticed it the next day. He was looking for one of his own letters when he saw it nestled in the corner. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and quietly smiled. That evening, he added one of his own. By the end of the week, there were 4 more. Some addressed to their grandmother, others addressed to no one, for when you feel like you've lost your place, for the next person who sits here alone. For me, 10 years from now. For the day I remember this one. Their grandmother never asked what was in them. She never opened any that weren't given to her directly, but she noticed. Of course she did. One afternoon, she ran her fingers across the envelopes like someone touching the spine of a well-loved book. She didn't need to read them to understand what was happening. Something had shifted. The box had become a conversation. But between who they had been and who they were becoming, Lily wrote. The most. Her letters were small and quiet, but full. She didn't try to be profound. She just told the truth of whatever moment she was living. She wrote to herself, to Owen, to her younger cousins who didn't yet understand what the box was. She wrote about doubts, little victories, poems that had gotten stuck in her head, dreams that came back in fragments. Each one folded and placed inside the box like a seed being planted. Owen's letters were fewer, but longer. Sometimes typed. Sometimes scrawled quickly after a long day. One was just a list of things he hoped to remember. Another was a single sentence. "You're doing fine. You don't need to be anything more than this." Even their father added one. No one saw him write it. But one morning it was there, tucked beneath the others. Sealed in an envelope with clean, slanted handwriting none of them had seen in years. It said, "Only to my kids, if you ever wonder whether I knew how lucky I was." Their grandmother read that one. She kept it beside her favorite chair for days, occasionally picking it up as if to check that it was still real. By spring, there were nearly 50 letters in the box. Some opened, some not. Some folded tightly like secrets. Others loosely, almost casual. But all of them honest. All of them offered. And that was the difference. The box was no longer something given. It was something shared. One morning, Lily came downstairs to find a new envelope on the table beside the box. It was addressed simply, "To whoever needs a reason today." She looked around. Her grandmother was. In the garden, Owen wasn't due over until the weekend. Their father was already at work. She picked it up, opened it gently, and read, "It's okay not to know what you're doing. It's okay to feel small or uncertain or tired. You are allowed to be all those things and still be worthy of love. You do not have to earn your place. You already belong." She folded it back up, placed it in the box again, and smiled. They never spoke much about the box after that. It didn't need explaining anymore. Like the quiet between two people who know each other well, it had become a language of its own, a way of saying, I see you. I've been there. You're not alone. Years later, when the house changed and the furniture shifted, the box moved too, but it always had a place, and the letters kept coming. Some written in joy, some in grief, some by hands much younger than hers had ever been. But all of them tied to the same thread. That love, when written down and left open, keeps speaking long after we stop.